Bows and arrows and cats. A toxophilite is somebody who loves archery. The reason for this is that toxin comes from toxon, the Greek word for bow, and toxic comes from toxikos, the Greek word for pertaining to archery. This is because in ancient warfare it was common practice to dip your arrowheads in poison. The two ideas were so connected in the Greek mind that toxon became toxin. Archery used to be ubiquitous. That's why there are so many people called archer, fletcher, arrow maker, and bowyer, bowmaker, in the phone book. In 1363, Edward III passed a law that required all men over the age of 14 and under the age of 60 to practice the sport once a week. Obviously, it wasn't so much a sport back then as a means of killing people. Edward III's law has never actually been repealed. So terms from archery are hidden all over the English language. For example, upshot. The upshot is the shot that decides who has won an archery contest. King Henry VIII's accounts for 1531 include his sporting losses and to the 3 cottons, for 3 sets which the king lost to them in Greenwich Park, £20, and for 1 upshot, one of the king. Tudor archery was not necessarily a pleasant business. There are 2 theories on the origin of the phrase, enough room to swing a cat. The first is that the cat is a cat of 9 tails, and that it's hard to whip somebody properly in a small room. The other theory is to do with marksmanship. Hitting a stationary target was just too easy for the Tudors, so the best archers used to test themselves by putting a cat in a bag and hanging the bag from the branch of a tree. The ferocious feline would wriggle about and the sack would swing, and this exercise in animal cruelty provided the discerning archer with a challenge and the English with a phrase. Incidentally, this has nothing to do with letting the cat out of the bag. That's to do with pigs, obviously. In medieval markets, piglets were sold in sacks so that the farmer could carry them home more easily. This was a pig in a poke. A standard con at the time involved switching a valuable piglet for a valueless cat or dog. You were then being sold a pup. Or, if you discovered the trick, you'd let the cat out of the bag. Unlikely as all that sounds, there are equivalent phrases in almost every European language. But to return to archery, all this sagit potent and toxophilite tosh brings us round to the odd phrase, point blank. The blank here is not your usual English blank, though it's closely related. The blank in point blank is the French blanc, which of course means white. The term bullseye is reasonably new. It was invented only in the 19th century. Before that, the white spot bang in the middle of the archery target was called the white, or blank. The funny thing about archery is you don't usually aim at the target. Gravity decrees that if you aim straight at the blank, your arrow will hit somewhere below. So you point the arrow somewhere above the blank and hope that this cancels out the effects of Newton's troublesome invention. That's why aim high is another archer's term. It doesn't mean that you'll end up high, or it's not meant to. You aim high and hit on the level. However, there's one situation in which this rule does not apply. If you are very, 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 very close to the target, in that case, you can aim straight at the blank point or white spot in the middle. And if you're that close to the target, you're at point blank range. Black and white. Etymologists have a terrible time distinguishing black from white. You'd think that the two concepts could be kept apart, but that wasn't how the medieval English thought about things. They were a confusing bunch of people and must have had a terrible time ordering coffee. The Oxford English Dictionary itself feebly admits that in Middle English it is often doubtful whether black with a K, or black with CKE means black, dark, or pale, colourless, wan, livid. Chess would have been a confusing game, but on the plus side, racism must have been impractical. Utterly illogical though all this may sound, there are two good explanations. Unfortunately, nobody's quite sure which one is true, so I'll give you both. Once upon a time, there was an old Germanic word for burnt, which was black, or as close to black as makes no difference. The confusion arose because the old Germanics couldn't decide between black and white as to which colour burning was. Some old Germans said that when things were burning, they were bright and shiny. And other old Germans said that when things were burnt, they turned black. The result was a hopeless monochrome confusion until everybody got bored and rode off to sack Rome. The English were left holding black, which could mean either pale or dark, but slowly settled on one usage. The French also imported this useless black word, and then they put an N in it and later sold it on to the English as blank, leaving us with black and blank as opposites. The other theory, which is rather less likely but still good fun, is that there was an old German word black, which means bare, void and empty. What do you have if you don't have any colours? Well, it's hard to say really. If you close your eyes you see nothing, which is black. But a blank piece of paper is usually white. Under this theory, blankness is the original sense, and the two colours, black and white, are simply different interpretations of what blank means. And just to prove the point even more irritatingly, bleach comes from the same root and can mean to make pale or any substance used for making things black. Moreover, bleak is probably just a variant on bleach and once meant white. Such linguistic nonsense, a lot more common than you might reasonably have hoped. Down means up. Well, okay, it means hill. But hills are upward sorts of things, aren't they? In England there's a range of hills called the Sussex Downs. This means that you can climb up a down. Down, as in fall down, was originally off down, meaning off the hill. So if an old Englishman fell off the top of a hill, he would fall off down. Then lazy old Englishmen started to drop the word off. Rather than saying that they were going off down, they just started going down. So we ended up with the perplexing result that the downs are up above you, and that going downhill is really going down, down. But we must get back to blanks and lotteries. Once upon a time, a lottery worked like this. You bought a ticket and you wrote your name on it. Then you put it into the name jar. Once all the tickets had been sold, another jar was filled up with an equal number of tickets, on some of which were written the name of a prize. The chap running the lottery would pull out two tickets, one from the name jar and one from the prize jar. Thus, way back in 1653, the court of King James I was described as a kind of lottery, where men that venture much may draw a blank, and such as have little may get a prize. Blank lottery tickets were thus the financial opposite of blank cheques, if you're British, and blank cheques spelt C-H-E-C-K-S if you're American, although as we shall see, the American spelling is older. Hat Checkpoint Charlie. Almost every word in the English language derives from Shah. Once upon a time, Persia was ruled by Shahs. Some Shahs were happy Shahs, other Shahs were crippled or dead. In Persian, that meant that they were Shah Mat. Shah went into Arabic. As well, Shah, ain't etymology fascinating? That went into vulgar Latin as Sacus. That went into vulgar French, all French is vulgar, as échec, with the popular échèze that went into English as chess. Because a game of chess is a game of king, the king being the most important piece on the board. And what happened to Shah Mat when the king is crippled? A chess player still says checkmate. Chess is played on a chessboard. Chessboards are a kind of are kind of useful because you can arrange stuff on them. For example, when Henry II wanted to do his accounts, he did them on, quote from a book in 1180, a quadrangular surface about 10 feet in length, 5 in breadth, placed before those who sit around it in the manner of a table, and all around it has an edge about the height of one's 4 fingers, lest anything placed upon it should fall off. There is placed over the top of the exchequer, moreover, a cloth, bought at the Easter term, not an ordinary one, but a black one marked with stripes, the stripes being distant from each other the space of a foot or the breadth of a hand. In the spaces, moreover, are counters placed according to their values. Look, just like a chessboard. And as Henry II spoke French, it was called the exchequer. That's why the finances of the British government are still controlled by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The S changed to X through confusion and foolishness. But chess and Persian kings don't stop there. We're nowhere near the end game. Let's continue unchecked. You see, when your opponent puts you in check, your options become very limited. You have to get out of check in one move, or it's checkmate, and the game is over. From this, you get the idea of somebody or something being held in check. Checking somebody stops them doing what they want, and that's why you can still body check people, and why government is held in check by checks and balances. Check, or check, spelled C-H-E-Q-U-E, began to mean somebody who stopped things going wrong. For example, the clerk of the check, whom Pepys mentions in his 17th century diaries, was the chap who kept a separate set of accounts for the Royal Shipyard. He checked fraud and served a good lunch. I walked and inquired how all matters and businesses go, and by to the clerk of the check's house, and there eat some of his good Jamaica brawn. And from there you get the sense of a check that is something that stops dishonesty. At a hat check, for example, you get a check to prove you're not stealing somebody else's hat. Bank checks were originally introduced as a replacement for promissory notes and got their name because they checked fraud. Bank checks started out being spelt with a CK on both sides of the Atlantic, but British people, perhaps under the influence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, decided to start calling them checks with a QUE. This has a peculiar etymological result. A blank check is a check with no check on it. Given that blank cheques are found from as early as 1812, it's a miracle that the first bouncing cheque isn't recorded in the dictionary until 1927. And from there you get check off, 1839, and check up, 1889, and then the Wright brothers invented the airplane, and people would fly around and navigate by distinctive landmarks called checkpoints. And then the Second World War broke out, and pilots were trained and given an examination or checkout. And then shops got checkouts, and roadblocks became checkpoints, and people went to doctors for checkups, and guests checked out of hotels, and checked in and check-ins wearing a checked shirt, and all, dear reader, all because of crippled shahs from ancient Persia. All of this has nothing to do with the Czech Republic, which is ruled not by a shah but a president. However, Ivan Lendel's wife could reasonably be said to have a checkmate. Sex and bread. Freud said that everything was secretly sexual, but etymologists know that sex is secretly food. For example, mating with somebody was originally just sharing your food or meat with them. Meat meant food of any kind, not just flesh. Likewise, your companion is somebody with whom you share your bread, from the Latin panis. The Old English word for bread was hlaf, from which we get loaf. And the Old English division of labour was that women made bread and men guarded it. The woman was therefore the hlaf dij, and the man was a hlaf ward. Llafward and Llafdig, Llaford and Llafdi, Lavord and Lavdi, Lord and Lady. And Indian bread is in the nude, but to explain I'm going to have to explain how half the languages in the world began, or at least the best theory on the subject. Once upon a terribly long time ago, 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, there were some fellows living between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Whenever one of them died, the others would bury him or her in a pit. They were therefore called the Kurgan pit burial culture. They also had some distinctive pottery and all the other tedious accoutrements of Neolithic man. Well, we call them the Kurgans. We don't know what they called themselves. This was in the time before the invention of writing, or even of the internet, so we don't know what language they spoke, but we can take a very educated guess, and that educated guess is called Proto IndoEuropean, or PIE for short. The Kurgans probably invented the chariot, and probably used it to invade their neighbours. However, they did those invasions in a deplorably disorganised manner. Rather than all banding together and attacking in one direction, they split up and attacked hither and thither. Some of them ended up in northern India, some of them ended up in Persia, some went to the cold, rainy lands around the Baltic, and some of them went to Greece and became Greek. Still others got lost and ended up in Italy. And it was, to put it gently, a big mess. We can tell where they went by digging up their burial pits and their distinctive pottery and whatnot, but their pottery is not what makes them interesting. They also took with them their language, Proto IndoEuropean, and spread it all over Europe and Asia. One would have hoped that this would operate like a reverse Tower of Babel, but it didn't. You see, all the different groups developed different accents, and these accents became so strong that their languages became mutually incomprehensible. After a few hundred years, the Kurgans in northern India wouldn't have been able to make out what their cousins in Italy were saying. If you want to see this process in action today, visit Glasgow. So the ancient Indians called their dads Pita, and the Greeks called their dads Pater, and the Romans called them Pater. The Germans, though, started pronouncing the letter P in a very funny way that made it sound more like an F. So they called their male parent Vater, and we call him Father, because English is descended from Old German. Similarly, the PIE word, sex, became German sex, English six, Latin sex, Sanskrit sas, and Greek hex, because the Greeks pronounce their S's funny. There are rules of pronunciation like the German P to F and the Greek S to H that mean we can trace all these fundamental words. That's how we can work back and take an educated guess about the Proto-Indo-European language. However, it isn't always so simple. Just look at the changes in pronunciation. It works very well on the great unchanging concept like fathers and numbers. However, many words change their meaning as they go along. Let's look at the Proto-Indo-European word neogu, which meant unclothed. In the German languages, of which English is one, neogu became naked. In the Latin languages, neogu became nude. But a funny thing happened in Persia to do with cookery. You see, the ancient Persians cooked their meat by burying it in hot ashes. However, they baked their bread uncovered in an oven. They still used the PIE neogu and therefore called their bread naan. Naan was taken into Hindi as naan. And if you go into an Indian restaurant today, you can still buy a lovely puffy sort of bread called naan, and it's etymologically naked. Some bread names are even stranger. Ciabatta is the Italian for slipper. Mazzo means sucked out, and pumpernickel means devil fart. Now, what has pumpernickel got to do with partridge? Concealed farts. Aubrey's Brief Lives contains this sad story about the 17th Earl of Oxford. This Earl of Oxford, making his low obeisance to Queen Elizabeth, happened to let her fart, at which he was so abashed and ashamed that he went to travel 7 years. On his return, the Queen welcomed him home and said, "My lord, I had forgot the fart." Farts are quickly delivered and slowly forgotten. The English language, though, has had much more than 7 years to let the world forget its flatulence. The smell of the original meaning slowly peters out. Take, for example, the phrase peter out. Nobody's quite sure where it comes from, but one of the best theories is that it comes from the French Peter, which meant fart. Peter definitely gave us the word petard, which means a little explosive, for reasons that should be obvious to anyone who's eaten beans. However, when Hamlet says, "'Tis sport to have the engineer hoist with his own petard," he doesn't mean that the poor engineer is raised into the air by the jet power of his own flatulence, but that he's blown upwards by his own explosive. The fart had ceased to smell. The same thing has happened with the phrase fizzle out, which once meant cutting the cheese, and was delicately described in one 19th century dictionary as an escape backwards. The same dictionary describes a face as a small windy escape backwards, more obvious to the nose than ears, frequently by old ladies charged on their lapdogs and blamed on their lapdogs. And fis itself comes from the Old English fist, which likewise meant fart. And by the 18th century, any little dog was called feist, and that's where we get the word feisty from. Little dogs are so prone to bark at anything that an uppity girl was called feisty, straight from the flatulent dogs of yore. This is a point well worth remembering when you're next reading a film review about a feisty heroine. The fart lingers. Our word partridge comes from the Old French pertis, which comes from the Latin perdix, which comes from the Greek perdix, which comes from the Greek verb perdestai, which means fart, because that's what a partridge sounds like when it flies. The loud, low beating of the wings sounds like the clapping of the buttocks when the inner gale is liberated. A polite, even beautiful word for foods that make your bottom quack is carminative. There used to be carminative medicines, for it was widely believed that farting was good for you, as in the rhyme, "Beans, beans, they're good for the heart. The more you eat, the more you fart. The more you fart, the better you feel, so let's have beans for every meal." This belief in the curative powers of flatulence was originally based on the idea of the humours. The body was thought to be filled with substances that could get horribly out of balance. A fart was like a comb or card being pulled through wool and removing the knots. The Latin for a wool card was carmen, which has nothing to do with the opera, but is exactly the same as heckling. Wool. Heckling is, or once was, the process of removing the knots from wool. Sheep are notoriously lackadaisical about their appearance, so before their wool can be turned into a nice warm jumper, it must be combed. It's easy to see how combing wool and teasing out the knots could be used metaphorically for combing through an oration and teasing the orator. But the connection is probably far more direct and goes to the Scottish town of Dundee. Dundee was a radical place in the 18th century. It was the local centre of the wool trade and was therefore overrun with hecklers. The hecklers were the most radical workers of all. They formed themselves into what today would be called a trade union and used collective bargaining to guarantee themselves good pay and perks. The perks were mostly in the form of alcohol, but that was to be expected. They were a political lot, the hecklers. Every morning, while most of them were busy heckling, one of their number would stand up and read aloud from the day's news. They thus formed strong opinions on all subjects, and when politicians and dignitaries tried to address them, their speeches were combed over with the same thoroughness as the wool. Thus, heckling. Wool is everywhere in language. If you possess a mobile phone, you're probably wooling your friends every day without even realizing it. You are, after all, currently reading wool. Or had you never noticed the connection between text and textile? That you send woolly messages on your telephone and read wool and cite wool from the Bible is all down to a Roman orator called Quintilian. Quintilian was the greatest orator of his day, so great that the Emperor Domitian appointed him as tutor to his 2 grandnephews, who were also his heirs. Nobody knows what exactly Quintilian taught them, but Domitian soon sent them both into exile. The 2 lines of Quintilian that interest us are in the Institutio Oratorico, a gargantuan 12-volume work on absolutely everything to do with rhetoric. In it, Quintilian says that after you've chosen your words, you must weave them together into a fabric, in textu iungantur, until you have a fine and delicate texture, textile, or textum tenue atque rasum, sort of thing we say all the time. We weave stories together and embroider them, and never try to lose the thread of the story. Quintilian's metaphor lasted. Late classical writers took up text to mean any short passage in a book, and then we took it to mean anything that was written down, and then somebody invented the SMS message. This sheepskin writing is all rather appropriate, given that the size of books depends on the size of sheep. Paper was invented in China about 2,000 years ago, but we in the West didn't take up the invention until the 14th century. Even then, paper was considered an Oriental oddity. The first English paper mill was founded in 1588. Before paper, readers had to make do with 1 or 2 alternatives. They could use the papyrus plant, which grew plentifully in Egypt. If you mashed up papyrus, you could make something that resembled paper. Indeed, it was similar enough that papyrus is where we get the word paper. Unfortunately, there's very little papyrus in England. Instead, we use sheepskins. And now you can too. Here's the recipe. 1. Take 1 sheep. 2. Kill it and skin it. If I will do that in the right order. 3. Wash the bloody skin in water. Then soak it in beer for a couple of days until the hair falls out. 4. Let it dry stretched out on a wooden rack called a tenter to keep it taut and flat. Attach it using tenter hooks. 5. After a couple of days, you should have something that's approximately rectangular with 4 sad extrusions that used to be legs. 6. Cut off legs and discard. 7. Trim the remainder down until you have an exact rectangle. 8. Fold in half. 9. You should now have 4 pages, printed front and back. They're roughly the size of a modern atlas. This is called a folio. All you now need to make an atlas of more than 4 pages is more sheep. Number 10. Fold it in half again and you'll have 8 pages at roughly the size of a modern encyclopedia. You'll need to slice the pages at the top to make the pages turnable. This is called a quarto. Number 11. Fold again. 12. Provided you started off with an average-sized medieval sheep, you should now be holding something pretty much the size of a hardback novel. This is called an octavo. 13. Fold again. 14. Mass market paperback. When Caxton built his printing press in the 15th century, he set it up to use sheepskin, not paper. When paper was finally introduced, it was manufactured to fit the existing printing presses. And that's the reason that both the text you're reading and the book that contains it are dependent upon sheep. Of course, you may be reading this on your e-book reader, but those have been designed to mimic the size of normal books, and you're still at the mercy of the sheep. Wool gets in everywhere in language. Muslim mystics are called Sufis because of their woolen suf garments that they wore. Burlesque dancers, on the other hand, are taking part in a nonsensical or trifling show named after the Latin burra, meaning a tuft of wool. Burras were used as coverings for desks, and that gave us bureaus, and then bureaucracies. Then there are all different kinds of wool. Cashmere came originally from Kashmir, and Angora came from Ankara, capital of Turkey. Turkey is, of course, the country you eat for Christmas. Turkey. Early explorers in the Americas saw flocks of turkeys singing in the magnolia forests, but the turkey is native to America. Indeed, it was domesticated and eaten by the Aztecs. Why it should therefore be named after a country in Asia Minor is a little odd, but explicable. Many animals are misnamed. Guinea pigs, for example, aren't pigs, and they aren't from Guinea. They're found in Guyana in South America. And it only takes a little mispronunciation to move them across the Atlantic. The pig bit is just weird. The same is true for the helmeted guinea fowl, or Numidia meleagris, which was once native to Madagascar but not Guinea. The helmeted guinea fowl is an ugly bird, has a big bony knob on the top of its head, hence the name, but it tastes delicious. People started importing helmeted guinea fowl from Madagascar to Europe, and the people who did the importing were usually Turkish traders. They were known as turkey merchants, and the birds they brought were therefore called turkeys. Those aren't the turkeys we eat at Christmas with bread sauce and relatives. The bird is Meleagris gallopavo, which is also delicious. It was the Spanish conquistadors who found Meleagris gallopavo in the magnolia forests and brought it back to Europe. It became popular in Spain and then in North Africa, and though it's a different species from the helmeted guinea fowl, the two birds do look surprisingly alike. People got confused. The birds looked the same, tasted similar, and both were exotic new dishes brought from somewhere foreign. So it was assumed that they were the same thing, and the American bird got called turkey as well, in the mistaken belief that it was a bird that was mistakenly believed to come from Turkey. In Turkey itself, of course, they didn't make this mistake. They knew the bird wasn't theirs, so the Turks made a completely different mistake and called it a Hindi, because they thought the bird was probably Indian. The French thought the same, and they still called turkey dindon or dinde, which also means from India. It's the most confusing bird. In fact, it was so delicious that though it was introduced to England only in the 1520s or 30s, it had become the standard Christmas meal by the 1570s. None of which explains why people occasionally talk turkey. Indeed, they demand to talk turkey. This all goes back to an old joke that isn't, I'm afraid, very funny. The joke involves a turkey and a buzzard. Now, it may be possible to eat buzzard, I don't know, but the bird's absence from any menu that I've ever encountered makes me suspicious. I suspect the buzzard is a fowl, and that's certainly the point of the story. Once upon a time, a white man and a red Indian went out hunting together. They killed a tasty turkey and a buzzard. So the white man said to his companion, "You take the buzzard and I'll take the turkey, or if you prefer, I can take the turkey and you can take the buzzard." To which the red Indian replied, "You don't talk turkey at all." This joke was immensely popular in 19th century America. It was even quoted in Congress, though history doesn't recall whether anybody laughed. But it was popular enough to spawn two phrases. By 1919, talking turkey had been altered somewhat. People had started inserting the adjective cold. Talking cold turkey is like talking turkey, only more so. You're getting beyond the brass tacks and down to the barest of bare essentials. Talking cold turkey was the bluntest, directest form of speech. And a couple of years later, in 1921, people started to use the phrase cold turkey to describe the bluntest, most direct method of giving up drugs. So going cold turkey has nothing whatsoever to do with the miserable leftovers, so sorrowfully consumed in the week after Christmas. Cold turkey isn't a food at all, even though it sounds like one. It's a blunt way of talking and a blunt way of giving up drugs. However, when you give somebody the cold shoulder, that is a food. Insulting foods. There are two sorts of guests, welcome and unwelcome. The host is not permitted to tell you which you are, though he may give you a clue. If your host cooks you a nice hot dinner, you're probably welcome. If he gives you yesterday's leftovers, for example, a cold shoulder of mutton, then he probably wishes you hadn't come round. It could have been worse, though. He could have made you eat humble pie. Humble pie is made using the umbles, or innards, of a deer. Here's a recipe from Nathan Bailey's Dictionarium Domesticum of 1736. Boil the umbles of a deer until they're very tender, set them by till they are cold, chop them as small as meat for minced pies, and shred them as much beef suet. 6 large apples, half a pound of currants, as much sugar, seasoning with salt, pepper, cloves and nutmegs according to your palate. Mix all well together, and when you put them into the paste, pour in half a pint of sack, the juice of 1 orange and 2 lemons. Then close the pie, bake it and serve it hot to table. Of course, the umbles are the worst parts of the deer. After a hard day's stag hunting, a rich man will dine on venison. Only his servants beneath the stairs would have to make do with umble, and therefore humble pie.